Welcome to the Agents Journal podcast. I'm Adam Horton, and if you're new here, the Agents Journal podcast is a collection of the lessons I've learned in building Hortons, one of the UK's first brokerages for self-employed estate agents. Today's episode is the first in the mini-series about the housing crisis. I'm joined by Russell Quirk. I introduce him in the conversation, but we cover everything from his background in estate agency, his experience in elected politics, and the causes of the housing crisis, and a bold idea in solving it. It's a fascinating conversation with lots of eye-opening insights, so I hope you enjoy it. Let's get into it, and here's my conversation with Russell Quirk. Joining me in this first ever guest appearance on the Agent Journal podcast is Russell Quirk. So Russell, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Adam. Cheers.
Russell is a real titan of the property industry with an estate agency background that goes back generations, which I'm keen to jump into the story behind in a moment. One of the trailblazers for the online market, founding eMove, and what has been then crucial in setting the foundation for the brokerage model we see today. Also been a councillor, now runs a PR firm and is a regular presenter on TalkTV. So it gives you a very unique perspective on the housing crisis. So let's get straight into it with your background, if that's okay, Russell. I mentioned there that you've got a history going back generations of estate agency. Could you talk to us a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, I mean, my family, I think, have always been estate agents. I mean, going back to my grandfather, he was a chartered surveyor in London, so based in Fulham. He worked for, I think it was the Cooperative Society, which obviously we all know. But back in the day, apparently they were property people, not just supermarkets and funeral directors. And so he worked for them as a chartered surveyor and took the very bold step. And I think, it's a bold step to go out on your own now, let alone back in the mid-1950s. He took the bold step of going out on his own and starting an estate agency business with a partner in Loughton in Essex. And he then opened another branch in Billericay in Essex, which he then moved to, and that's where I was where I was born. And by the time I left school at 16, that business had 14 traditional estate agency branches, plus a survey department, mortgage department, and so on. So it was what we would even consider today, I think, to be quite a reasonable sized independent estate agency company. And my dad and his two brothers were in the business helping run it. And my memory as a child during the kind of, I suppose, certainly the mid-late 70s, early 80s, was of this kind of Dallas, South Fork type thing, where we happened to all live next door to each other. So how weird is this? So where my grandparents bought a house in the 50s in a place called Norsey Road in Billericay, which I'm sure no one listening to this will know, but anyway, it's quite a prestigious road. Not many houses in that road at the time, and my grandfather owned a kind of triple plot, and he gave the left-hand plot to my father and the right-hand plot to one of his other sons. There were three of them in total. And so I grew up in a kind of a muse of three nice houses, large houses, all interconnected by one driveway. It's all the cousins playing. But I guess as a formative thing, if that's what we're going to get to, as a formative thing, I started to learn about estate agency and business, I guess, from the age of about 5, 6, 7 years old, wandering around my grandmother's apron strings with my cousins. And this is going to sound very misogynistic, bearing in mind this is the mid-70s. While she used to serve a cooked breakfast to my dad, his two brothers, and my grandfather, as they sat around the dining room table in that house, and that was their morning meeting. And I remember every morning, Monday to Friday, the four of them would get together at 192 Norsey Road, or 190 Norsey Road actually was their address. And that was the meeting, Nana cooking breakfast, all of us kind of, because we live next door, running in and out. And you would pick stuff up around, a conversation about a manager that was about to be fired, or a conversation about the market outlook for, bearing in mind this was the mid-70s and oil crises and a different government every 10 minutes, a bit like today. So anyway, they were my formative years. So by the time I left school at 16 in 1984, I was completely indoctrinated, to be honest. And I suppose really had little choice by way of my autopilot than to go into estate agency. So I did. A lot of my cousins did. Obviously, by the time we did that, the company itself had kind of fragmented, and my grandfather had long since passed away, and my dad and his two brothers, they didn't fall out, but decided they just didn't want to do it anymore, didn't want to work together anymore, so they kind of sold off most of the business, went off into doing other things. But between us, the next generation, so from grandfather to my father's generation, then to our generation, over the next 20 years, between three of us, three of the cousins, we set up and ran separate estate agency businesses between us that also covered basically the footprint of Essex that our grandfather's business also covered back in the 60s, 70s and 80s. So it's quite a nice story, I think, Adam, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I think unless you've grown up in an environment with a family business, it's probably quite difficult to appreciate what it's really like being around those conversations as a child. I had a similar experience, by sounds of it, but much smaller business. But I think it just sows a seed, doesn't it, from such a young age about normalising conversations around business that wouldn't have otherwise happened until you're well into your kind of career, your working life. And
yeah, the other thing that I should be very clear about is that apart from being indoctrinated because it was kind of all over you, there wasn't the discipline within the family to push us all to go to university. I think only 2 of the 11 cousins went to uni. I had an expectation, I think, well, I'll just do what my dad did because he did what his dad did. So an estate agency to me was still, having grown up with it, quite glamorous. But the other honest and very truthful aspect that I liked was that most of the time my dad, his brothers and my grandfather seemed to have lots of money. So, big houses. My dad was a car nut, which I am. So he would have a new car every 6, 7, 8 months. And that appeal as a 16-year-old coming out of school was that, well, why wouldn't I do that? I know the business. It's the family business. It looks like it's quite lucrative. My dad's, in and out of Merc Sports and E-Types and God knows what else, left, right and centre. Yeah, I'll have some of that. So I think there was an absolute mercenary element to it as well, without having to go through the rigmarole of 5 years at sixth form and university and then going to work for someone in a law practice, for instance.
Yeah, that's quite nice how these figures, your grandfather, your dad were the inspiration. I think that's really nice. So
Yeah.
So if we fast forward, well, you tell me how many years later, when you first had the idea for eMove, or when you started to appreciate how the internet was going to impact the property market?
Yeah, so I guess kind of back to a kind of family link. My dad, my cousin and I had the opportunity to buy a very traditional single branch estate agency business in 1999. So the gap between me going into estate agency when I left school and 1999 is that 15-year gap. Because my family went off and did loads of other things, I kind of followed my dad a little bit into motor trade. He had car dealerships, so I did that for a while. Then I went out on my own and worked for Lancaster Porsche, selling Porsche and Ferrari. So that was a very interesting endeavour. Went to the city for a little while, money broking, and then cars again. We had the opportunity to buy this very downtrodden, very kind of old-fashioned estate agency business off a mate of my dad's in 1999. We then decided to really kind of go for it and expand, because obviously the market was with us. For those that remember, 1999 was kind of 2 or 3 years into the market, kind of popping back and doing okay again. So we opened across, again, pretty much the pattern of territories that the original Quirk and Partners family business had. So Canvey Island, Basildon, Langdon Hill, Stamford-le-Hope, Grays, so that they were the areas that, my dad had always said, hey, they were good offices, they'd make big money. So we thought, well, okay, let's just open offices there again. So we had 6 branches. My dad left the business, just left it to me and my cousin. That did very, very well until the financial crisis. And then we kind of hung on to that, didn't go bust, but split up, did our own thing. And it was at that time that I'd started to think about the effects of the internet and automation, I suppose, and how it was affecting retail and travel. I mean, this is back in the day where, lastminute.com was maybe 6 or 7 years old and they'd floated it on the stock exchange. And you start to think, what can't be commoditized by the internet? This is clever stuff. And bearing in mind, I'm going back 18 years now. So it was a novel thing at the time. So I thought, well, I wonder if there's a way of kind of commoditizing and automating estate agency through the power of the internet and through not just the internet, but technology. So through CRM related process, if you like, can we sell lots of houses with fewer people? And so that was the kernel of the idea, which I think I started to have in about 2006. I registered a domain name in 2006, which was futureagent.com, and had a website built. My cousin at the time didn't really believe in it. And he said, no, I don't think that's the way of it. Obviously, because it was all about cheaper fees. And turns out he was right, rightly so. Why would we go into a business charging 400 quid when we're currently getting 2.5 grand in Canby Island, So anyway, when we split up, and I was left with a little bit, what was left of my side of the traditional estate agency business, I managed to sell that in 2009. And I thought, right, I am now going to go for it with this eMove thing. So started with not that much money. You can imagine selling a traditional estate agency business in 2009 in the middle of the financial crisis. You're never going to get big money for it. So I sold it arguably at completely the wrong time, because 2 years previously, that business had been doing fantastically well, was very profitable. Anyway, I was determined to have a go, and it was all about an exit. It was all about building an online business, eventually raising money, which I knew nothing about, by the way. I had no idea how to raise money, and then to try and have an exit, a bit like the lastminute.com thing. And that was my kind of benchmark. So started eMove with not that much money, built a website, messed around with some Google ads, started to get a little bit of traction. I remember, first goal was sign up 10 clients. Next goal was sign up 100. Then it was 100 a month. And by the time we finished, 2018, when eMove went bust, we were signing up 1,000 sellers a month. So it was a decent business, and we'd done merger deals, had done all sorts of stuff. So I'd by then raised capital investment through high net worth individuals, through venture capital and crowdfunding, all sorts of different means. I think I'd raised 9 rounds of funding totaling £27 million. But for a business that had really run away with itself, if I'm honest. And, from originally an idea to build a very efficient business with not that many people and then sell it or list it on the stock exchange, we ended up with a business that not only was huge in terms of 100 plus staff, but was consuming money because of the money we were having to spend on marketing, particularly on TV and Google ads, to keep up with, by that time, all these other entrants that had popped up, like Purple Bricks, like Yopa, and so on. So a very, very crowded space, loads of money being spent on customer acquisition, which rendered the whole business model completely completely unjustifiable. It just didn't work. It just didn't have integrity really as a financial model. So that basically was the idea, the execution, and the failure of that business. And indeed, look, Purple Bricks, House Network, they've all failed, right? Because the sector has room for some alternative players. And I think, one of those that really springs to mind as a success is Yopa. I think Verona Frankish has done an amazing job to make Yopa a success. Obviously, they've now developed a self-employed model to rival yours, Adam, sorry. But take that as a compliment. I think that they see the space as being sufficient to expand into. So I think with the exception of Yopa, everybody else has failed because the unit economics don't work and the marketing costs are huge. But one thing I learned from eMove, which is why I now run a PR firm, was the power and the value for money, the cost efficiency of PR. Kind of really hit me in the face, as in, wow, this done right, this really works, right? So creating thought leadership expertise through content and research and getting lots and lots of press mentions as a brand really lifted eMove above all of our competitors, including Purple Bricks, actually, when it came to things like credibility, authenticity, awareness. Because the power of PR, of course, is that it's not an advert. It's not you writing an advert and sticking it on the side of a bus or on a Google ad. It's the Times or the Telegraph or Property Industry Eye referencing your comment or your research, which gives it third-party validation and authenticity. So we pioneered that. Having fired loads of PR agencies, actually, which we did, I think 4 or 5 agencies between 2009 and 2014. I had this revelation one day that PR agencies couldn't really keep up with our appetite for volume. So I sacked the fourth or fifth PR agency in succession, brought in someone to help me run PR day to day that I then would sit and work with from an idea perspective for them to go and research and write. That person was a guy called James Lockett, who I employed at eMove in 2014. James Lockett is now my business partner in proper PR. And he's just an absolute genius at looking after clients, writing, distributing, monitoring, and doing a really superb day-to-day PR job for lots and lots of clients. So out of the ashes, I guess, of the failure of eMove, came this kind of eureka moment that, well, actually, if let's just say, for the benefit of the comment section on your podcast, the only good thing to come out of eMove, and there were plenty, believe me, but you could argue the only good thing that came out of eMove from my point of view was the revelation that PR was good and effective, but I could do it really well, particularly alongside someone like James. And so that was why within, minutes of eMove starting to inevitably look like it was going to fail, we set up the business, took on a couple of clients, and now we've got about 25 across the property sector. And we're 6 years old now. Who would have thought? 6 years old as a PR business. And we are, I think it's fair to say, very successful, very profitable. We don't owe anybody any money. We got some, not just fantastic clients in terms of name, some big names now, but also some fantastic clients that have been with us for 4 or 5 years that we just love to bits, love working with them, frankly. So yeah, look, you haven't said much, Adam. Sorry, I've just kind of taken over the last 20 minutes. But that's the kind of, that's 2009 to 2018 and to now, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, the success of the PR that you were doing and the prevalence of the brand that you built with eMove, I suppose when the business did start to turn and it was coming to the end of its life, that also meant that failure was very, very public at the time. I remember seeing it in the Property Industry Eye and other places and kind of reading about it.
In the national press.
Yeah.
The failure was in the national press. Yeah. That's the downside of being gobby. Yeah.
Yeah. But what was that like? Do you mind me asking what it was like personally going through a very public failure like that? But also, is there anything that you think is a real common misconception that if the wider perspective was just what people read in the paper or saw on Pi or whatever, is there anything that you think that people generally don't quite understand about the story of eMove?
Yeah. Look, good question. So let me deal with the second question first. So that the misconception was that, the business was designed like a traditional business to be, to have more revenue than overhead, as in making a profit. Now, what I started to realise when I first started taking on investors, and just, without going too far down the rabbit hole, the first investment deal I did was with James Kahn, so from Dragon's Den. He had a team around him of accountants, business managers and lawyers that, whilst they were a pain in the arse, frankly, I learned a lot from them. And in particular, when James Kahn was kicking the tyres on the eMove business and doing the due diligence, he brought in a team of, in particular, 3 individuals. This was really clever on his part. Brought in a team of 3 individuals from different backgrounds to really delve into the business, into me, into the proposition, the market, and so on. One of those guys was Shiraz Dar, who was the former marketing director, the chief marketing officer of Prime Location and Find a Property, which was then later bought by Zoopla. Smart guy. He launched J2O, I think, for Brickvik when he worked for Brickvik. Smart marketeer. Jonathan Galore, who was the chief technology officer for Wonga.com. Do you remember them? So they've gone now, but that was a multi-billion-pound business. Jonathan was not only a technology guy, but a very smart investor, who then went on to be a partner at Silver Lake, which bought Zoopla, right? So these are the caliber of the people that I had on the board. And then another guy, a glorious individual called Ivan Ramirez, who was an American guy, lived and worked in Salt Lake City in the US, had sold his business to Groupon.com for whatever number, I don't know what the number was, but probably 7 or 8 figure number. He became our chief technology officer. But before that was also the chief technology officer at Groupon.com, having sold his business to them. So I've got these guys around the table that really understand technology, startups, marketing. And honestly, Adam, what I learned from those three guys in terms of the world of startups, venture funding, growing fast, and an exit, right? And so this is 2012-13. I'm an unqualified, gobby Essex estate agent with an idea that I've managed to keep afloat for by then 3 years off my own steam, right? All of a sudden, I'm sitting around a table in Mayfair with these top dogs, these titans of e-commerce, basically. And I learned a lot. And what the whole play was all about from 2012 until we went bust in 2018 was, right, this is a punt. Let's just have a go. We're going to raise money. We're going to spend it on tech and marketing. We're going to grow and go really fast. And right at the beginning, it was the odds are this won't work, right? Particularly if there's loads of competition or whatever. But it was a punt. It was an endeavour. So it was never, a business to grow nicely to profitability. It was all about growing the top line, not the bottom line. So revenue fast, taking market share, proving concepts, and then selling to Connells or Foxtons or Countrywide, which we nearly did, by the way, several times, or float on the stock exchange. So the misconception is that this was a failure as a business, that we cocked up the numbers, we lost money. It was never that business. And the same as Uber was never that business, the same as Deliveroo was never that business. Now, you got to remember that back in 2012, 13, 14, 15, there was this mad world of investment capital from, Andreessen and Y Combinator and whoever. They were chucking SoftBank, they were WeWork, right? They were throwing billions and billions of pounds at businesses just to get the exit out the other side, so that the share that you owned was now worth £4 on exit rather than the pounds you paid for it. That was the play. I think still a lot of people in the traditional estate agency industry don't understand that we weren't really in the estate agency business. We were in the growth business and the exit business. So that's the misconception. So that hopefully answers your question in terms of what didn't people understand. And I suppose that links back to how did I feel about the failure. So on the one hand, I suppose I kind of half expected it, because it was this kind of vehicle that was always designed to be, it's a bit like a one-use rocket ship or a gun, a plastic gun that only fires 3 bullets. You know what I mean? It was always going to do its job until it didn't, and it was always going to be precarious. So that cushioned the blow, I think, because it wasn't like a family business I'd run for 30 years. We just, cocked it up and ran out of money. It wasn't that. That said, I was obviously very emotionally attached to the eMove business because it was my baby. I founded it on my own, no partners, no co-investors. I founded it at home in my lounge in the same month that my wife had twins, and we already had a 15-month-old daughter. So I've got 3 daughters, and they were literally, 0 years old, 1.5 years old, as I launched that business from a laptop in my lounge. So you can imagine, and the pressure on my wife, Carolina, and I, because we've come out of a business, sold it for a few quid. I think I had 70 grand to my name, to be honest, but I had to live. I had absolute passion and belief in the eMove concept and put everything into it in terms of money and time and resource. So that played havoc with family life, because of course I'm not around much. Eventually I moved into an office, and then we have a couple of staff, and then it grew and grew and grew. So there was all of that. So by the time it failed, bearing in mind it failed 9 years later, this wasn't a flash in the pan. We survived for 9 years, loads of staff, loads of revenue, and so on. But the feeling of going bust, despite the fact that it was always on the cards, I suppose, because of the very nature of the business, was still, an emotional slap in the face, frankly. And not just, and I suppose for a couple of reasons. One, because you then got no salary, right? So I literally had nothing to earn from, because I hadn't sold a share. I didn't nick any money out of the business. I was on a salary. The about 6 weeks before we went bust, we all stopped being paid, as in the staff, including me. right? So I didn't take a salary, went busted December. I think my last pay packet was October, maybe even September. Anyway, so you got the financial implications and challenges. But then, as you referenced, as you alluded to just now, Adam, then you've got the humiliation. You've got this guy that has tried to change estate agency by slagging off traditional agents for being too expensive and inefficient, who then falls on his sword, much to the glee of the commentariat on Property Industry Eye. So that is a thing that sends you one way or the other. You either retreat, turn to Carlsberg Special Brew or other harder substances, and just give up, which I think a lot of people do, or you flick a switch, dust yourself down, realise that you've got to stand up for yourself despite that humiliation, that failure, and you've got to go out and earn a few quid to put food on the table for your wife and your 3 young kids.
Well, it sounds like there was no hesitation with that being if in the moments that you knew that the business was coming to an end, you'd already established what your next vehicle, was going to be.
I had to. And if you were to ask me, what's one piece of advice for people that are thinking about anything around career, whether it be a new job or a career change, but particularly if you're thinking about starting a business, which I would wholeheartedly still recommend, by the way. There's nothing like being your own boss, having that freedom and flexibility, and seeing the fruits of your labour. I mean, literally, the more you put in intellect and time and money, the more you get out of it. But that advice that I would give is, there's a number of pieces of advice around, not giving up and so on. But it's to take risks and just not worry about failure as much as people do, I think, and just to kind of crack on regardless. The worst thing that can happen is not death or disability or whatever. It's a bit of humiliation and having to work out how you're going to pay the bills. And so my advice is definitely just do it, crack on, don't fear failure so much, because otherwise you'll never fulfill your potential. And I'm a big one for encouraging anyone to be, I know it sounds like a cliche now, it sounds like a bloody life coach, but being the best version of yourself, I think is a matter of pride, right? So I don't want to go to my deathbed thinking, if only I'd done that, and if only I'd risked this, so if only I'd invested that. I'm not that guy. Now, I know a lot of people are that guy, right, and girl. They want a comfortable lifestyle. What I would say to those people is, fine, it takes all sorts. If you want to be an employee and earn 35 grand a year for the rest of your life and have a company car and be at the behest of a dickhead of a regional manager, that's fine. Do that. Don't criticise me for eMove, though. Go fuck yourself. Sorry, Adam. Don't criticise me for eMove, because I had the bollocks to do it and you didn't. There's your soundbite, Adam. But I mean that. Some of us, and it ain't just me, all of the other online entrepreneurs and those that have had a go at a prop tech business, you've got to admire their guts and their risk-taking ability, and the fact that when they fall over, let's take Michael and Kenny Bruce as an example, lauded for how much money they personally made out of Purple Bricks, but they had failures before Purple Bricks, businesses that they went into with Harry Hill, for instance, that failed, and they had Booming, which was a failure. But so what? They are masters. They're very clever and hardworking and studious, but just pick yourself up. Failure is not terminal. So, but anyway, I did feel bruised. I did feel humiliated, but I had to get back on the bike. I had that choice, either to sit there in the corner with a can of Special Brew, as I say, or to get back up and have some humility and some pride. But also, what if you don't? Who's going to feed my family? Who's going to put food on the table? Who's going to pay the mortgage? So it becomes a question of survival, I think. And that really has always been my instinct. Yes, I want to earn well and have a nice life and, a nice big exit one day out of something. But there's a massive survival instinct that some of us that like the buzz, I suppose, and the benefit and the opportunity of doing something for yourself, that comes with a downside, which you have to get your head round, that if there is a downside, if you do fail, you've got to be prepared to shrug it off and, dust yourself off and go again. You have to.
Yeah, I had a business fail. My first estate agent business, I set it when I was 20, and we'd got out of business by the time I was 22, 23. It didn't last very long at all. But I just found that the opinions of even just the agents in the local market was exactly as you described in the comments of Pi. But yeah, obviously tried again, and this time it's we're surviving for a little bit longer. But it makes me think that we've got something very wrong as a society about our view of failure that perhaps is very different overseas.
In the US, particularly in the US, there's no success without failure. I mean, that's generally true in terms of just the realities of someone that succeeds has failed in the past. But failure is almost seen as part of the journey to success, and it's not lampooned or lambasted. But here, I don't know why Brits have such. I mean, there's a real irony, right? And this is a bit of kind of human psychology, I suppose. Most people want to be successful. I mean, that's why the lottery exists. That's why Love Island and the X Factor and shitty shows like that exist, because people want a shortcut to success and fame. They want a Lamborghini and a big house. They don't really want to work for it, so they try and get on X Factor or they buy a lottery ticket, right? So it's a given that people want the trappings of wealth and success. However, when they see somebody else that's worked hard and toiled and taken risk and had a success despite having maybe some failures in the past, when they then fail big time, they laugh. They think, oh, good. I'm glad that Russell Quirk fell on his face. I'm glad, because he might have been successful, and maybe that makes me look a bit crap because I'm not. Right? That's exactly what goes through people's minds. And I think it's a really sad and quite pathetic trait in many people that they don't, they're not philosophical about someone that fails. They don't think. I mean, when Boomin failed, and I spoke to Michael and Kenny Bruce, do you know what the conversation was? Have a guess what it was. It wasn't, oh, that was a bit shit, boys. Oh, you really cocked that up. Oh, God, I wonder what you're going to do. Do you know what the conversation was about? What's next, guys?
Yeah.
What's next, boys? And Michael Bruce said to me, well, obviously something. I'll keep you posted, right? And it was just terrible. And people lost jobs and people lost money. Yeah, of course they did. But the upside of people that take that chance and risk, it ends up being businesses that now we know and love that employ tens of thousands of people. No business started without the idea, the commitment, the resource, and the risk. So all of the businesses out there now that are employing, what was the SME sector employing in Britain? 16 million people. All of those businesses exist because an entrepreneur started with an idea and had the balls to carry it through and took risk. So yes, there's failures, but if we all are scared of that failure, there'd be no new businesses. How scary is that? It would be like a Labour government had taken over. Oh, shit. I have. Anyway.
That leads us on perfectly to get into the second part of this conversation, which is around politics and the housing crisis. But you've had a bit of a background in politics already, haven't you? You're a councillor, and I thought that would be a good place to start because you, which you'll talk about in a minute, had some experience in the planning side of things, which we'd like to jump into. But could we start by just talking about what it means to be a councillor? Because I think the average person has got a pretty good idea of how central government works, and they vote for their local MP, and they know councillors exist. But actually, it probably makes a bigger impact in some ways, day to day, with your local council than it does central government. But there's just a real lack of understanding about what actually goes on day to day with councillors, what the responsibilities are, and what sort of impact they can make. So could you give us just a bit of an overview of what that is like?
Yeah. I mean, I was a councillor for 8 years in Brentwood as a Conservative. The last year, actually, myself and a few others fell out with the local Conservatives, and so we sat as independents for the last year. And there's a whole story behind that in terms of what we then decided to do to take control of the council as these upstart independents. And we did, by the way, for the last year. We took control of the council away from the Conservatives as a message, as a bloody nose, not to be arrogant, not to be complacent, not to be incompetent when it comes to your electorate. But anyway, that's a whole different podcast. So I was a councillor for 8 years. I was encouraged to be so by Brandon Lewis and Eric Pickles. So Brandon Lewis was the then leader of the council, so he was the leader of the Conservative Council. He then went off to be an MP and was also then latterly, I think, the housing minister. He became police and fire minister, then he became chairman of the Conservative Party, and then he became cabinet secretary for Northern Ireland, so big, important role. So Eric Pickles was the MP for the area, and those two ganged up because my dad and Brandon's dad were friendly years and years and years ago. And I'd got involved in a local campaign where I lived, and they saw that I'd done that and therefore encouraged me to become a councillor, which I said no to initially because I was just too busy with the traditional estate agency business, actually. So this was 2005 and 2006. Anyway, eventually I agreed, got elected, big night. We got a call from David Cameron because so many of us got elected in one hit in Brentwood. So that was all very lovely. And I guess that to answer your question properly, that there's a perception and a reality when it comes to being a councillor. The perception is that you're going to change the world and that you can really do loads of stuff. There's also a reason from the point of view of some people to become a councillor, which is to show off how much power you've got. I've seen councillors on the train where their name tag on their bag says, Councillor John Smith, and you just think, what a wanker. Seriously, it's such a tosser thing to do, right? What you should be is a councillor that genuinely wants to make a difference and change things. And I was all about trying to innovate the public sector and apply some private sector mentality to the public sector. And Brandon was brilliant at letting his senior councillors, which I then soon became, do that. So you can kind of stretch your legs, really kind of implement innovation and policy. And some councils are famous for having done that. Westminster Council back in the 90s, that they were brilliant at being innovative. The problem with being a councillor is also, obviously, you've got lots of enemies, right? So you've got the press who hold you to account and they just want a quick headline. I ended up on the front page of the Brentford Gazette many times, sometimes for the right reasons, sometimes for the wrong reasons. Stuff I'd said in emails that got leaked, stuff I'd said in the council chamber where I was not, I didn't do anything wrong, but I was, fun enough, as you'd expect, very outspoken, very opinionated. The other enemy was the other parties, obviously, Labour, Lib Dems in my case, who would just try and make life difficult. If I said I'd found a magic money tree in the back garden and I could add £1 million to the council budget every year through that tree, they'd find a reason to vote against it, right? They'd find a reason. Pure politics. It's a disgrace. But the other thing that people don't realise, and if you're thinking about becoming a councillor, anyone listening to this, if you do so, do it with this in mind. Your biggest opposition is the council's own officers, in my opinion. Now, the civil service, whether it be in Whitehall on a national level or at council officer level at local level, if you recall programmes like Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister and think about how funny they are, Humphrey, blah, 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 that is an absolute version of the truth. You have council officers and civil servants with their own agendas, their own political persuasion, that want either the status quo, they just don't want work disruption, they don't want to do new stuff, they don't want to have to rewrite policy and change the way that the council does stuff, or they have an agenda that is not the same as yours, so they work against you. And there's no truer than in the planning process. My experience of council officers, and obviously not all of them, but I've rarely met a decent one, honestly. Most of them are power crazy, they are pedantic, they are lazy, and they are obstructive. So if you're a council officer in the planning department watching this saying that's outrageous, prove to me with your numbers, your data in your planning authority that I'm wrong, right? Because the planning process is so lazy, so full of obstacles, so pedantic, so problematic. And often it's because officers either aren't working very fast and very hard, or they don't like developers, or they don't want certain things built in certain places, despite the fact that the council's local plan might dictate such. So your biggest obstacle is the officers. And whether you're in the environmental department or you're chairman or cabinet member for education or for assets or for transport and roads, whatever, you will find that the officers try and call the shots, and the officers try and get in the way and obstruct councillors, who councillors actually should be the ones that set the pace on vision, strategy and so on. The reality is different. And what tends to happen, and it's happened in Brentwood where I live now, I don't mind saying, the officers set the tone and the strategy and just have the councillors to rubber stamp what the officers want to do. Now, I can tell you, Adam, that is not constitutionally correct. That is not democratically correct. But it happens across, I would say, most of the 440-odd local authorities in Britain. And it's one of the reasons why planning is so broken. It's one of the reasons why councils own so many assets that are inefficient. It's one of the reasons why potholes don't get fixed. It's one of the reasons why our education system is so stuffed. It's one of the reasons why the public sector has a much higher rate of absence than private sector, and so on and so on. Council officers in the public sector, I think, are inefficient and genuinely often very obstructive. So hopefully I haven't put anybody off too much being an elected member of local government. But if you are to venture such, go into it with your eyes wide open, as I've just said. And the majority of councillors, honestly, Adam, will end up going native because council officers are very clever. The conversations I used to have where a council officer would say, well, councillor, let me just explain. Or, well, councillor, what you need to understand is, well, councillor, let me just tell you why we can't do it that way.
Sure.
And one of the reasons that I was so outspoken is because generally when it came to such conversations with officers, my favourite word in council was noted. Just literally, as you're being told what you can't do, I'd go, noted, and then do it anyway. Mm. And we need more people like that in national and local politics. Anyway, sorry, mate, long answer, but it taught me a lot. Taught me a lot about the public sector. I now use these scenarios when I'm on talking about the civil service and so on, because I've been there, seen it, done it. There's a reality to our civil service, which, by the way, is bigger and more bloated than ever. There's now 510,000 civil servants in Britain. The state is bigger than ever. It costs more than ever. The wage bill for civil servants across the nation is 16 billion, not million, billion pounds a year. And these are people that predominantly want to work from home. And if they are in the office on a Friday, they still think it's okay to go home after lunch because they're in the public sector. It is an absolute scandal. And I'll stop now because otherwise I'll go off on a rant.
Well, it sounds very similar to what you hear people that say about central government when they come out of elected politics. Like I've heard Rory Stewart in various interviews talked about how if you're a minister for a department, it's better if they don't have any degree of specialism in what they're appointed to do because of the civil service agenda, or and that kind of follows through into scripted cabinet meetings and all sorts of crazy stuff.
Yeah. They run down the clock, so they know that there'll be a new minister in 2 years, so we'll just keep this guy sweet and then just destroy everything he wanted to do, ready for the next guy and start again, because the officers just want either an easy life or they have their own agenda. I remember I was working with a client, a PR client actually. I won't say where because it would be obvious who it was, but there was a planning element to it, and we were helping on the community engagement and the kind of community PR. And we got involved with a couple of council meetings, and there were questions being asked of the council leader. This wasn't Brentwood, by the way. This is somewhere miles away. And the council leader's answers to the question were written in advance by the council officers for him to read out verbatim. And I was watching this thing thinking, oh my God, it's literally the unaccountable running local government. It's scary stuff. And look, maybe to many people listening to this, it won't matter, but it does, because when you elect a local councillor, you expect them to be your representative, and you elect them on policy and character and whatever else. If actually they don't have any power, really, it's the unelected officers that are calling the shots. Well, then that's bogus democracy, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, all of this stuff, I think, is important to the national picture with the housing crisis side of things, because I suppose Labour have announced that they want to build 1.5 million homes. That's something I want to talk to you about. But that obviously local government is critical to the delivery of that, isn't it? So my question's on that point, and just building more houses. Do you think that's going to happen? And in terms of the ability to scale up the amount of properties we're building, like what are the things that are holding that back in the delivery of more new homes?
There is more chance of me taking a penalty for England than there is of Angela Rayner building 1.5 million homes. It simply isn't going to happen for a whole bunch of reasons. So, first of all, when Angela Rayner talks incessantly about 1.5 million homes over this Parliament, 3 to 375,000 a year, they're just words. And I criticised someone, a Labour MP on Twitter this morning, who said, look at the stuff we're doing. We're building 1.5 million homes. And I replied, no, you're not. You're actually not. You definitely are not. And you're not even on the way to it, because this year we'll only build 160,000 homes. You need to build 370,000. So you're way. You're not even hitting 50% of what you need to. And here's why, right? First of all, we don't have the materials to ramp up from 160,000 homes to 375,000 in a year, right? We don't have the labour. We don't have the bricklayers, the sparks, the carpenters. We just don't have the people to do that overnight. And this is what the Labour government are saying we're going to do. Lots of people lament the planning process, and the planning process is terrible, and it's broken, and it's obstructive, and it's full of officers with agendas, as we've just said. Fixing the planning system will help a little bit, but it's not the magic bullet that everybody seems to think it is, and it's really frustrating. The proof, and I do like proof, I do like a bit of evidence, Adam. Why is it that there are 1 million unfulfilled planning permissions in Britain right now if the problem to building more homes is planning? Well, surely those million would all be built, wouldn't they? Why haven't they been? Well, for the reasons I've just set out in terms of labour and materials, but there's also a much bigger and more compelling reason which government it simply won't be able to fix. And that reason is that if you think about the amount of homes that are built by the top 10 house builders, so Bovis, Bellway, Persimmon, Tully Wimpey, whoever, they build the majority of new homes in this country. They build about 70 to 80% of those new homes. Those builders, who I admire, by the way, as proper capitalistic organisations, I bear them no criticism, I really don't. But they are not beholden to Angela Rayner or the government. There is no diktat, there's no gun to their head, there's no incentive even for them to build more homes. If Persimmon build 20,000 homes a year, which is the biggest I think they do, it's about 20,000, 15 to 20,000. What we're asking Persimmon to do, and this is the logic, right? This is what you won't hear anywhere else. You're effectively asking Persimmon to build 40,000 homes a year next year. Well, notwithstanding planning and materials and resource, if the top 10 house builder doubles output and you end up with them building 80% of 375,000 homes, that influx of stock onto the housing market will do what? It will soften the market and reduce prices. If you're the chairman, CEO and the shareholders and the board of Persimmon, why would you double efforts, double investment, stick a load of money and time and resource into building more homes to end up getting less per unit than you would have done otherwise? Why would you do that? You won't, right? It's literally not going to happen, not just through capacity, but because we have allowed the majority of new build output in this country to be delivered by 10 companies that are beholden to shareholders and shareholders only. So Angela Rayner and Matthew Pennycook, who's the housing minister, and Keir Starmer can stand up all they like saying, we're going to build this many homes. Well, the problem with that is governments don't build houses. We haven't built homes as council houses and affordable homes and public sector housing since really the 80s. And the last time we built 300,000 homes a year was in the 1960s under the Macmillan government. And the majority of those were council houses at the end of basically as we came out the Second World War. Why don't governments and other property experts understand what I understand? I mean, genuine question. What I've just said, so I'd love anybody to argue with me on this point, right? If you think Persimmon are going to double output in 2026 and can physically do so, call me and enlighten me, because it's an absolute impossibility. So roll forward 4 or 5 years to the end of this Parliament, fingers crossed that goes quickly, 2029, I suspect we will have built no more houses than the Conservatives did in the last 4 or 5 years of their tenure. The talk is cheap, the rhetoric is easy, the headline grabbing is standard. It ain't going to happen.
So are you saying that if the government want to achieve much more ambitious goals for building new houses, are they going to have to build it themselves? Is that the answer? And is that predominantly social housing, council houses?
Well, I mean, yes, obviously there's a huge shortage of social housing and council housing. No one builds council housing anymore. It's been taken over by housing associations, of which there are over 1,000, many of which now build for profit. So they don't just build social housing, they build retail housing and make money. And that's because their CEOs all want to be paid £250,000 a year. Again, sweeping statements, have a look it up. It's all true. That's what we've walked into. So yes, we need to build council houses again. I have a plan, Adam. I wrote an essay 4 or 5 years ago, which I've showed to a bunch of politicians since, that works as a practical solution to building sufficient houses in the UK to solve the housing crisis. No one's interested in it. And the reason that politicians aren't interested in it is because it doesn't convey credit for that initiative until the job's done 10 years down the line. No one that exists as a politician now, as a housing minister, cabinet secretary for communities and housing, prime minister, chancellor, nobody will be around in position in 10 years' time. So they're not interested in a solution like mine because they won't get the credit for it. It's an absolute outrage. It's an absolute travesty. That I'm telling you is where we are. We're not going to solve it. We're never going to solve it because housing can't be solved as a crisis in Angela Rayner's 2-3 year tenure, or whatever it's going to be as deputy prime minister. So yes, we do need to build our own housing as a government. There's loads of public land to do it on. There'll be loads of investment to allow us to do it. No one has the will to do it because politicians are too jacked up on instant headline grabbing credit in the Sun, the Mail, the Express and the Mirror.
And so, 2 questions off the back of that. What do you think needs to happen? What is the theory in the essay that you wrote about a solution? And how could that actually change? How could the status quo change where there could be a much more long-term vision that deals with the politicians' need for winning headlines and credit and working their way up their career ladder? Like, how do those two things balance?
So you have to set up a National House Building Development Corporation as a separate entity. You have to then fill that entity with smart people that understand house building. So you take, the ex-CEO of Taylor Wimpey and the ex-chief financial officer of Bellway or whatever, whoever those people are. You then set up a strategy which is signed off by that entity and signed off by ministers, which involves, first of all, the identification of housing need across all areas, all local authority areas across Britain. And you can look at housing need in terms of the need for affordable housing, social housing, because those two things are different, and retail housing, house type, house size, house tenure, on a local authority basis based on demand, either through using data on house purchases or indeed looking at housing waiting lists through local authority housing departments. So you then work out on a map-by-map basis where housing is needed and indeed, importantly, what the tenure that's needed is, because in Tower Hamlets it will be very different to Kensington, for instance. So you then have a map of demand. You then look at all of the public sector owned land, of which there's about 180,000 hectares of publicly owned land across Britain. Some of it is open land, some of it's buildings. I did a job after I was planning chairman at Brentwood, I became the asset committee chairman, where I was tasked with looking at, sorting out and making more efficient the land and buildings that Brentwood Borough Council owned. After loads of resistance from those council officers that I talked about earlier on, I managed to get a massive map, huge, great foolscap map of everything that Brentwood Council owned on behalf of the public. And it was shocking. I mean, shocking what Brentwood owned. And we colour-coded it. Stuff we own and we know we own, and then we've got the deeds for. Stuff we own and we know we own, but we haven't got the deeds for. Stuff we think we own, and stuff we might own. I mean, literally, I kid you not. there was stuff that we owned as a council that everyone had forgotten about, like a 999-year lease that had been granted on a building that's now a pub in Brentwood High Street, and the rent, without any review, was £1,000 a year. That is a true story from Brentwood Borough Council when I was the Asset Committee Chairman. Now, extrapolate that across Britain. You will be able to find public sector land owned by local authorities, by the Fire Authority, by the NHS, the Ministry of Defence, by the Education Authority, that will cater for all of that demand that I've just set out in the demand maps. You then take the commensurate amount of public sector land in those areas and build the right properties of the right tenures in the right places. You build a mix, not just of affordable and social housing, but also of housing that is sold for resale. So you become a property developer, not just a social housing provider. The profit that you make out of the 4-bed detached houses and the 3-bed penthouse flats, for instance, goes back into the pot and ultimately funds the social housing and the affordable housing. After a period of time, it becomes profitable. So the money, the excess, the surplus, because you're turning disused public land that is currently not being used and worthless, you're maximising the value and then taking profit from it. Even after you've built the required social and affordable housing, there's money left over. That goes back into the pot, which then should be used for other public services like GP surgeries, schools and so on. I've made it sound really easy, but the outcome will take years to come to fruition. I mean, you tell me, Adam, does that sound like a mad scheme, or does it sound like one that's actually full of common sense and can be done? Because I can do it, I can pull that off. But no one is interested in doing it for the reasons that I've set out.
So, I mean, yeah, it does seem like perfect common sense, and it's frustrating that the political system set up in a way where someone could be presented with something like that, and despite them being able to look objectively at it and think this seems like a pretty good idea, that there's just no interest. Because, I mean, could you give me an insight into the sort of conversations you've had with the politicians who spoke to this idea? Are they literally just saying, great idea, but I've got other things to focus on? And...
No, they pay lip service. I've shown it to Conservative politicians who shall remain nameless because I know some of them quite well, who flicked through the A4 pages of the presentation, just went, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
And I was just taken aback by the apathy. And then I had the conversation about credit, and it was made very, very clear that, yeah, but the next guy's going to get the credit, right? And I think I said to this particular person, who gives a shit? And they said, well, we do. Politicians definitely give a shit. I went, wow. So you're saying that this isn't going to be introduced as a solution, not because it's not the right solution, but because you won't get the credit? And he just kind of shrugged. Yeah. Then I went to the Labour Party conference. I think it was in, oh God, what year was it? Oh, Adam, I can't remember. 2017, I think it was. And I announced it on a fringe event, and sat next to me was John Healey, who was the shadow housing minister. And I articulated it, and it was said to me afterwards, not by John necessarily, but by others in the room, yeah, it sounds a bit Tory. Genuinely, that's what someone said to me. I went, again, I said, who gives a shit? Who cares whether it's red, blue or yellow? I'm a Tory. I'm giving it to you as a Labour Party for when you come into power, which obviously they now have, to run with the ball and solve the fucking crisis. Who cares whether you think it's smacks of some left or right ideology? Who genuinely, who cares? These are the clowns, Adam. These are the tossers. These are the people that are running our country that we have to deal with. They don't do solutions. They do credit. They do lauding. They do headlines. I mean, again, prove to me I'm wrong. I've lived this experience. I was on GB News a few months ago, and I'll name the guy that I was with, Matthew Stadlen. Look him up, right? He's a very smart left-wing commentator, son of a judge, nice bloke, actually. I clash with him terribly, politically, but he's a good bloke, right? He's all right. And I told him about this. We were arguing about housing, and afterwards I said, I've got the solution. And he went, okay, what is it? I told him, sent him the essay, and he's connected with a few Labour frontbenchers. I've chased him 2 or 3 times. It's not his fault, by the way. He's put this in front of people. And again, on the Labour government, they're now the government, and they've just gone, Yeah. Yeah. That's all right. We got this. No, you haven't. You definitely haven't got it. I'll bet. I think Piers Morgan did this the other night on Question Time. He bet the Labour government £1 for every house they don't build of the 1.5 million that they're claiming they're going to build. So in other words, you say 1.5. I reckon you'd be lucky to build about 800,000 or 900,000. So there'll be a deficit of about 600,000. So if I'm right, give me 600 grand. Anyway, look, it's so frustrating.
When you talk about credit, I mean, I don't know all the detail behind the origins of the NHS, but it feels like we need some kind of cross-party approach to housing in the same way that the origins of the NHS were formed, in terms of there was a consensus that the National Health Service was needed, and then the credit comes down to the performance of the National Health Service rather than actually setting it up in the first place. Is that a fair assessment? Like, do you think there's any scope for a cross-party consensus towards housing like this, or is that just?
I think it's too much of a political football now. I think it's too ideological. The Labour Party, want to use the stick, and they want it to be all about affordable and social housing. And actually, without getting too political, Rachel Reeves' budget already says, I mean, her budget, not my words, hers, that they're going to allow another 2 million people into the country over the next 4 years, right? So those people have to be housed. So the majority of those 1.5 million homes are going to go to people that come to this country afresh anyway, right? So there won't be any. If you're on the waiting list now as a young mum or a young family that's been kicked out of your kind of bed and breakfast or whatever, and you're waiting now for a council house or a house from a housing association, you've got no chance. A, because the 1.5 billion aren't going to be built, and secondly, because most will go to immigrants, I'm afraid. And that's not me being political. That's just a mathematical fact, right? 1.5 million homes. Rachel Reeves says 2 million people are coming to the country. Well, they're not going to live in holes in the ground, are they? So you've got the Labour ideology on one part. You've got the Tory philosophy on the other, which is all about ownership and owning a house and helping first-time buyers and so on. They're too wrapped up in the ideology to actually fix the problem. I mean, it's when you're a first-time buyer and the Tory government say, well, here's a lovely help to buy scheme, and here's a help to buy ISA, and we'll match this, and we'll help you with the deposit, and we'll cut stamp duty. Well, that's all great, but what does that do? That fuels demand. It doesn't help supply, does it? It's moronic. Yeah. So I can't see there ever being a consensus because of that difference in ideology between left and right. But they're also the fact is, apart from the credit thing, I mean, we've now got the shadow housing secretary is Kevin Hollinrake. Thank God, at last, right? Kevin Hollinrake is an estate agent. He founded Hunters, and he's still the chairman of Hunters. He is a man, as the shadow housing secretary, that understands property and housing. Thank God. He's the first housing minister or shadow housing minister we've had that understands the brief for probably 20 years. Holding out hope for some consensus or cross-party thing, I don't see how this gets fixed until you somehow change the traits of human behaviour. And the fact that people in government just don't understand their brief. I mean, you've got a business secretary, Jonathan Edwards, who has not only never run a business, he's never had a job. He's only ever been a politician. I mean, and how can anyone that doesn't have any experience of a department, how can they innovate and improve that department, whether it's housing, whether it's education, whether it's the NHS? I just don't get it. I just don't understand.
And there's something so critical to our economy, but yet such a lack of understanding of what the average business owner is going to go through in their journey in entrepreneurship. It's offensive that they put someone in that position. That
we can debate, the fact that we select the wrong people for political jobs. They're not ordinary men and women from decent backgrounds that cover, some from health and some from business and some from education. That's maybe more true on the Labour side, I suppose, but they tend to be politicos rather than and union people. And on the Tory side, you leave university at 21, you go and work for Conservative Central Office as a bit of a in marketing or in membership for 2 or 3 years. Then you become a bag carrier in Westminster for an MP. Then you fight a seat that you're going to lose, but it's good experience. By the time you're 27, 28, you've been loyal. You end up then being picked to fight a seat you might be able to win. By the time you're 30, you're an MP, but you've never had a job. That's one of the problems. Kevin Hollinrake is an absolute exception, And I bet you'll find that he wasn't the Conservative Party's first pick for Thirsk, I think is his constituency. Brilliant as I think he is as a businessman and a property guy. Because, again, my experience of being selected as a candidate, and particularly when it comes to MP selection, is central office want to parachute their own loyalists, their own spads and bag carriers into constituencies because they trust them, and they're also made in the same mould as the Conservative Party bosses. This is just another reason why the country's in such a mess. We've got the wrong people in power.
Well, Russell, you've been really generous with your time. I've got one last topic that I want to touch on very briefly, if that's okay with you, which is rental stock. Obviously, stamp duty, the surcharge on stamp duty for additional properties has just been increased in the recent budget, and that's a string of changes through Labour and Conservative governments that have been attacking landlords. And it seems like anyone that I speak to in the property world seems to understand pretty easily that making it less attractive to be a landlord is going to hurt rental supply and therefore contribute to the rents going up. What's your opinion on why has that been the case through both ends of the political spectrum? And I don't know, your thoughts on what needs to be done to solve the issue over kind of exponentially rising rents?
Yeah, I mean, look, you can only solve the problem of rising rents if you have more supply. It goes back to the conversation we've been having over the last hour or so. And if you demonise landlords because your ideology, whether you're a left-leaning Conservative government as we had under Sunak, or whether you're now even more left-wing under Starmer, the problem is that the ideology dictates that landlords are bad people. That's what the ideology states, and they're rich, and they're some of the probably older than you to remember this, but the Rackman landlord types that were, aggressive, gritty, evil people that treated their tenants like rubbish. We all know in the property sector, 99% of landlords are good. They think about and care about their tenants and the quality of the accommodation. They're good people that own less than 3 properties, and it's their life savings squirreled away into an entity that's going to provide them an income. But the media and politics, whilst it sees and portrays landlords as the pantomime villain, I think I like to call them, you're just going to deter them because, first of all, they get a bad rep, particularly from tenant groups that I've been on the wrong end of a few times, frankly. But also from legislation. So it's very easy for a party, a government, to turn the screws on a section of society that they don't like, to earn money from them, or to over-regulate them, or to allow them not to have much control over, what a tenant does, whether they pay or not, how long they're there for, which is all the Renter Rights Act, basically. By turning the screws and demonising them, obviously, it will just mean that landlords leave the sector, which ironically is the public, is the population of the public population increases and stock reduces, you're going to get rent increases that are even more pronounced, right? So again, there's a logic here. It's schoolboy economics that, again, the government doesn't seem to understand. You haven't got enough homes for rent. Landlords control most of them because the government have done a really bad job at providing social and affordable housing. Oh, I know what we'll do. Let's deter and piss off the last few landlords so that there aren't any rental properties left. And I'm sure what will happen is all those tenants that are paying £800 a month for their 2-bed flat in, wherever, Toxteth, they'll just buy the flat, won't they? That's the answer I'm given by tenancy radical extremist tenancy groups that think all landlords should be put up against a wall and shot. And I say that because someone sent me a tweet once as a landlord saying that I should be put up against a wall and shot. The lunacy, the nonsense of the way that some people join the dots on this, I mean, it does the opposite of solving the problem. What actually we should do is to covet landlords. We should allow them tax relief on mortgage payments and on maintenance. We should scrap stamp duty on buy-to-let properties and allow landlords to continue to do the job that the government hasn't been able to do through incompetence for the last 20 or 30 years. But again, you and I can wax lyrical about what should be done. You've got a cloth-eared government that the last thing they're going to do is listen to someone like me, no matter how pragmatic and practical I think my solutions are. Governments are driven by ideology, which is, this government, frankly, is hate the rich, whether you're a farmer or someone with a big house and inheritance tax, or a business or a pensioner that's got, 20 grand's worth of savings, let's say. Hate them. You're all rich. Don't like you. Let's bloat the worker. And by worker, what the government actually mean, Adam, is public sector. So let's have, more civil servants, more people in the NHS, more pen pushers, more clipboard carriers. Let's increase their salaries by 10% per annum. They'll always vote for us. That's how we stay in power. But there's one problem with that, which is if you, again, demonise landlords, farmers, business people, pensioners and so on, what happens is they sod off to other countries and pay tax somewhere else. And so your trillion pounds a year that goes into the treasury every year that pays for our schools, our roads and our hospitals becomes 900 billion, becomes 800 billion, like it did in the 70s under the Wilson and Callaghan government. So you end up with a brain drain and a money drain. Then the government has to borrow more and more money to fuel its obsession with bloating the public sector. Then the country goes bust because it doesn't have enough money to fulfill the checks that it's written. And then we have to go hand in hand to the International Monetary Fund, like some South American junta-led country. And then we are so well and truly done as to probably then get bought and paid for by Qatar and China. That's the route we're heading if we're not very, very careful over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think I had a text message from a friend this morning who ran a marketing agency. He's over in Dubai at the moment, and that's just one of like loads of different people. And you see this exodus of people who are wealth creators and kind of contribute so much to society that are just being deterred to move away. And I think we spoke earlier about society's view on failure. I think there's a whole different conversation to be had, I suppose, about society's view of success. And again, some of the...
And before anyone on the left says, yeah, but why don't you want to pay tax? People are not concerned about paying tax, but they don't want to pay more tax than just about anywhere else in the world. Yeah. When you add up what we pay in fuel duty, VAT, high rate tax, if you're someone that earns between 100 and 125 grand a year, because you lose your allowance as your tax rate goes up, you're paying a marginal rate of about 65%, then add in stamp duty, then add in inheritance tax. I'm slightly guessing here, but you're probably paying 80% to the government on everything you earn in reality over your lifetime. It's 35, 40%. Yeah, maybe. We all understand that, nurses and firemen and police officers and teachers have to be paid for. But when you feel that you're going to be rinsed, bearing in mind the Conservatives, we ended up with the highest tax burden since the Second World War. Rachel Reeves has just increased that even further. You've got places like Dublin who have a corporation tax rate of 12% against our 25%. You've got places like Italy with a flat tax for migrant entrepreneurs of 100 grand or 100,000 euros, whatever it is, and Dubai with very little tax. Why would you want to work hard and give 80% of everything you earn away?
Yeah. And aside from tax, people like that want to be around other successful people and where the talent is going as well, isn't it? So
very true.
Vicious circle.
Very true. So yeah, I don't know if we put the world to rights over the last hour and a half or so, Adam, but we've had a good go, I think.
Yes, it's been a fascinating conversation. Really enjoyed it. It'd be good to catch up maybe midway through this Labour government to see what sort of progress they're making towards these sort of goals. And
Well, I might be 4 or 5 hours ahead in Dubai, like lots of people. So as long as we can make the timings work, fine.
Yeah. Thank you for joining me. Been really interesting. Thanks, Russell.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Adam. Cheers.